Well, I'm very happy to say I've got Chris Worden back with me today to talk about hunters. And I know mention of the word hunting these days triggers all sorts of emotions. The attack on hunting today is being led by none other than the English Prime Minister's wife, who's got an absolute bee in her bonnet about hunting. And so we live in a world where hunters have got a bit of a bad name, but that's not something we're going to deal with today. We're just going to talk about what did happen and the part that hunters played in opening up Africa, and not only Southern Africa, but East and West. Hunters were involved in every colonial adventure, and Southern Africa is no different. So, Chris, just thanks for your time again, and take us back to the beginning of the early hunters and the part they played in exploring and opening up Southern Africa.
Thanks, Hannes. Yeah, I quite agree with you. You know, the whole reason why I'm sitting here at this amazing place called Victoria Falls is because we've got the early hunters to thank. And I'm just going to go right back to the beginning. The first people from Europe to come to Africa were the Portuguese. And Vasco da Gama landed at Cape Cross on the Namibian coast, 30 kilometers north of what is present-day Swakopmund in 1452. And then Diego Sao, another Portuguese, landed at the same place in 1486 and put a cross up at Cape Cross because they ventured into the interior and most of the party died in the desert. And then there was a long, long time until 1796 when Francois Le Valiant, who was a Frenchman, traveled into the interior from Cape Town and recorded a whole lot of birds and animals. And he wrote a 2-volume book called Travels into the Interior of South Africa in 1796. And then there was John Barrow in 1801, who also wrote a book traveling into the interior of South Africa, but they never got further north than the mountain range where you are living in Darling, that Ceres and Outeniqua mountains. Then Robert Moffat came and set up Kuruman in the 1830s. And then we go back to my favorite subject, David Livingstone, who traveled with his good friend, William Cotton Oswald, venturing north across the Kalahari Desert. And if you look at a map, which I will send John a map to add on to this interview. If you look at the western boundary of the Chobe National Park, there is a long straight line. And if you fly over Botswana, you can easily see it. That is an elephant path. And it goes for hundreds of miles. And Livingstone and Oswald walked along that elephant path and they found the Zambezi River in 1851. But they didn't go up downstream to the falls then. Livingstone came back in 1855 and discovered the falls, and he realized that Linyanti was in the wrong place. And he wanted to move Chief Sekeletu and the Makalolo tribe to higher, safer ground. So he went to look for his path, as I explained in my previous interview, to the West Coast. And while he was traveling, the London Missionary Society sent 2 missionary families to replace him at Sekeletu. At Sekeletu's village in Linyanti. And these were Holloway Helball and Roger and Isabella Price and their 6 children. And they arrived at Linyanti in 1860 while Livingstone was still traveling. And Chief Sekeletu didn't trust them because Livingstone hadn't told them that they were coming because he was naturally unaware. And he gave them an oxen to feast on and some beer. And he poisoned that oxen and the beer. And half of the party died. But Roger, Price, Isabella, Isabella Helmore and 2 of the Helmore children survived. And they escaped from Linyanti, and Isabella died in the middle of the Mababi Depression, which is in the present-day Chobe National Park. And the Makalolo dug up her body, which is quite interesting. But fortunately, Roger Price and 2 of the Helmore children managed to get back to Kuruman and explain to Robert Moffat what had happened. So now people were wary about going up to the Zambezi River. So what happened in 1860, same year, William Charles Baldwin, who was a famous hunter who hunted off a horse and was the second person to discover the Victoria Falls, bypassed Linyanti, and he found a number of pans, which are now on the present western boundary of Zimbabwe, bordering Botswana. And he would basically hop from pan to pan. And then he ended up at what is present-day Decker Camp, where he encamped his horses because there was good water, and went down to the falls. And then he was followed by Thomas Baines and Chapman in 1862, using the same route. Edward Moore was the first German in 1870, and then in 1871, George Westbeach, which is a very familiar name from this region, and his friend Blockley opened up a store in what is present-day Pandamatenga. Pandamatenga is the border post, one of the border posts between here and Botswana. And now these people, these hunters, were trading, and they were coming up, opening up the Victoria Falls. Any questions so far?
This is a very Anglo-centric account of the early hunters. What about the early Boers? Jacobs, Jan Viljoen, they were busy at around the same time. I think they had already struck up a relationship with Mzilikazi, and they were hunting in what is now central, or up on the Highveld in Mishonland of central Zimbabwe.
That's correct. In fact, I'm actually looking at a very interesting list of people that came up here. And most of them were Griquas, so what we sort of call half-castes. And George Paulson, August 1860, met William Charles Baldwin near Tamasanka Pan, which is a very, very prominent pan on the western boundary of Wangi National Park. And they walked from the Batetsi River, reached the falls on the 2nd of August 1860, and then they headed into the interior in what you were calling the Highveld. And there's another one, Arend Joseph, another Griqua hunter, a fugitive from the Cape. He was up here in August 1860.
Yeah.
Martinus Lucas Swartz.
There was Lee, and Selous met up with Pete Jacobs, and said, "This guy knows more about hunting than anybody else I've ever come across." These guys had been operating in that area for quite a while, but as I mentioned earlier, they didn't. I don't know if they could write, these Boers, so not much is recorded. But
that's yeah, you're quite correct. 1875 is when Selous came to the falls with another hunter, Jan Africa. Have you heard of him?
I think he was mixed race. He was probably a Griqua.
Yeah, a Griqua, hunted at Pandamatenga with his son in 1875. Based himself at Kazuma Pan.
There was Jacob Botha. There was another interesting Afrikaner by the name of Lee, Johannes Lee. He was a massive guy. He was over 7 foot. He was also up there hunting elephant, using those smooth bore, massive pieces of equipment. You had to be a big guy to operate one of those things. I think that's why they were mostly big big guys.
It's interesting that all these early European hunters had these Griquas basically as their scouts and their escorts because they were amazing hunters themselves.
Yes.
And I've just found out a thing here about Pretorius, which is the father of the Pretorius that we were talking about in the previous interview.
Yeah.
Now, he spent 2 years stuck on the Zambezi because all his cattle and horses had succumbed to tsetse fly. And he died of fever at Decca. And he was buried at Decca.
Okay.
So that, just because of that Helmore and Price massacre, that made everybody divert from that elephant trail going up to Linyanti and come along what is now the present boundary of Botswana and Zimbabwe. And that Hunter's Road is starting to become quite a popular 4x4 enthusiasts trail. And you probably find most of these people driving along this trail probably haven't got a clue about all the history.
Yes, yes, and what a rich history it is, Chris. And then there was Cumming, Gordon Cummings, I think, who also came in after Baldwin.
That's correct. He actually met Livingstone in 1849, and they became good friends. And he was 6'7" tall, a Scotsman that used to hunt in a kilt. I mean, everybody wore trousers in those days. Not Roel and Gordon Cumming. He would wear a kilt. And he helped Livingstone and William Cotton Oswald. They were all mates.
Tough guys.
And he wrote an amazing book in 2 volumes, 5 Years Hunting.
Chris, and then he was further up, but another great elephant hunter, Karamojo Bell. And the difference between him and the other guys was he preferred small caliber weapons. I think he was using a 257 at one stage, but he certainly got stuck in and moved around a lot in Central Africa.
In East Africa. Yeah, Karamojo Bell wrote an amazing, one of the most popular hunting books, Wanderings of an Elephant Hunter in East Africa. It's a very valuable book. Well, Frederick Courteney Selous basically opened up what I call the sort of modern history. You know, he came quite a bit after all these guys that I've been speaking about, but he basically put down what we call present-day Zimbabwe onto the map. He did a lot of hunting in the Highveld, in Mashonaland. He wrote some amazing books. I think every single hunter, professional guide, safari enthusiast has a copy of his Hunter's Wanderings in Africa. Very famous book. He wrote Sunshine, Storm and Rhodesia. That was his second book after Hunter's Wanderings. Nature's Notes and Reminiscences. And besides his hunting, he did a lot of research.
Yes.
Plant materials, insects, birds, medicinal uses of plants. So even though he was a hunter, he was a conservationist.
Yes, yes, he was. He was a great naturalist, and as we know, he was also a soldier, and that's how he met his fate.
Well, it's quite interesting how he was shot in 1919 on Lake Tanganyika, which was then German territory.
Yeah, the story is a sniper got him.
That's correct. He popped up his head to have a look at what was going on, and he was shot in the head by a sniper.
And apparently when the German commander von Letterforbeck heard that Selous had been killed, he was absolutely mortified. And I think he wrote to Selous' family to express his sorrow and his sadness of not ever having had the chance to meet him, because he'd heard a lot about Selous and was hoping to meet him at some stage. And he was very distressed to hear that he'd been killed in action.
Well, I think I'm correct in saying, in one of my readings I read the other day, that the First World War had actually ended. But these guys on Lake Tanganyika hadn't got the message yet. So it should never, ever have happened.
That's quite true. And then talking about not knowing about wars, the story goes that one of those hunters up in northern Mozambique completely missed the First World War. I'm not sure which one it was, but he didn't know it had started and he didn't know it had ended until I think the Germans came down south into Mozambique, and he heard about the fact that the world had just been in a massive punch-up, but he had no clue what had happened.
That's amazing. You know, when you're stuck in the bush, it's amazing what you do miss out on.
But Chris, just talk a little bit about the equipment that these guys were using. What weapons? I know a lot of them were carrying Rigby's, some were using Jeffreys, but they were all, most of them were using very heavy caliber weapons.
Yeah, 500 caliber. You know, unfortunately, I'm not too au fait on weapons, but from my readings, they mostly had either a double, and it was at least a 500 caliber.
And going a little below the belt, as it were, what do we know about their relationships with the local people? And there are lots of stories about Selous having taken a native mistress. I wonder what you know about their personal lives on these long expeditions.
Most of them got on very, very well with the local tribes. And I actually believe that Livingstone had a mistress who was his cook. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's quite a few little Livingstones running around present-day Zambia and Malawi. You know, a lot of them had mistresses. And you read their books, and they said that the African women were very, very beautiful.
Chris, Colin Brander, who was became very close to Rhodes and was very much part of the whole Rhodes story, although on the sidelines. Was he originally a hunter, Johan Colin Brander?
Johan Colin Brander was a hunter, but he was also a military man, I'm led to believe.
And he obviously got up to know Lobengula quite early on, because he seemed to be quite a useful intermediary.
Correct. And it's quite interesting is how these hunters, these early hunters, stuck with the missionaries. So, for example, Robert Moffat, when he came up to see Lobengula, he was in the company of hunters. And so they worked very, very closely together. I've just got one other very interesting thing. You know, there's a lot of controversy about who were the first people to actually come through here. And of course, we know about Livingstone being the first Westerner to discover the Victoria Falls, but we forget about the Portuguese. And it's quite interesting that there was a man called Antonio da Silva Porto, who walked from the west coast to the east coast of Africa in 1853. So 2 years before Livingstone. But his diaries were burnt in the Great Fire of Lisbon. And so there's a possibility that Porto was probably the first person to come and hunt and explore through this region. And then there's another man called Serpo Pinto.
Pinto, he came from the eastern side, I think.
That's correct, in the opposite direction to Silva Porto. And apparently, rumor has it that Livingstone kept avoiding him because they were traveling at the same time. So there's a lot of things we've still got to research and learn. It's every day. You know, in my readings, I learn something new.
Yeah, this chap Serge Pinto, they were tough guys too, boy. They they went into the wilderness there, and they somehow they prevailed. What I only discovered the other day for the first time, Chris, is that the Portuguese were getting busy up around Tet, growing heroin, growing poppies. There was an unfolding heroin crop taking place there. And the British found out about it, and they were absolutely furious, because this would have interfered, or had the potential to interfere, with the heroin trade into China, which they were controlling. And
the opium wars.
Yes, and so the Portuguese were given a rap over the knuckles and told to stop that, because this was the heroin was a major leverage factor for the British in Asia, and they didn't want it interfered with. But they were growing poppies or whatever, and doing very, very well out of it, somewhere near Tet.
Well, interesting, when Livingstone came up with the Roberts, his boat, on his second expedition in 1858, he brought with him a geologist called Thornton. And they ended up at Tet, and he mentions the poppies in his book, his second book, The Zambezi and Its Tributaries. And it was interesting that Roger Thornton, his geologist, found coal at Tet. And as you know now, Tet is one of the major coal-producing areas in southern Africa. So there was a lot going on with the Portuguese. And the most important thing was cotton, because Britain was getting all their cotton from America. And the slave trade, the slaves were growing the cotton in the southern states. So the Americans controlled the price. And Livingstone proved that the cotton that was growing on the southern Shiri highlands of Malawi and the Batoka Plateau in southern Zambia was much easier to grow and of a higher quality. And he took samples back, and the British were very, very keen to get Africa colonized and teach the Africans commerce, the three C's: commerce, Christianity, and civilization, so that they could buy this cotton from the Africans and snub the Americans. Very interesting politics between America and Britain during that stage.
Very interesting. There is an enormous amount that went on that very few people know about. And well, it's quite interesting. But one of the motivating factors, we're straying a bit off the point, but one of the motivating factors in triggering the quest for empire was the English love affair with tea, and the fact that they needed sugar with their tea. And this was the reason why they struck out and went into the Caribbean and started taking over colonies, was really to grow sugar to keep the Brits happy with their afternoon tea. And it all worked out well. And so it set in motion a whole process, which ended up in the British Empire.
And that's why you had Natal, present KwaZulu-Natal around Durban, growing sugar. The Zambezi Delta, huge sugar estates, because the British were diverging now into southern Africa.
That's right, and that's why the port at the Delta there at Chindi, I think, was pretty much British controlled. It was within a Portuguese colony, but it was the Brits who were pretty much running the maritime traffic through there, and that was the sugar.
And it's quite interesting that port of Chindi is actually on an island in the Zambezi Delta, which Livingstone landed on with the British steamship, the Pearl, and he hoisted a British flag on that island. and proclaimed it as British territory. And that's why they had that port there.
Well, and there's another interesting follow-on to that, the great Norman Carr. We're talking about early hunters, but Norman Carr, I think, was born in Chindi.
That's correct, and I'm very privileged to have known Norman Carr.
Yes, I knew him too. In fact, I got to know him quite well during my time in the Luangwa, but that's where he came from. And I don't think he saw. Then he was sent to school in England, and he was gone for 10, 12 years. I don't think he really even saw his parents. And it was when he came back, he started moving around and ended up shooting elephant in the Luangwa. But yeah, his story starts in Chindi. His father was some sort of maritime engineer, I think, who was involved in running the port there, which would have been part of moving the sugar back to England.
And it's all because of these early hunters and missionaries.
Yeah, that's right. They certainly were the frontiersmen of the time, and they did open things up and really change the world in a huge way.
And most of them came here because of the dreadful weather in England. They had some sort of ailment, and they came here for the sun.
Interesting. Well, Chris, thanks again. Thanks for your time. Another very interesting discussion, and I hope we can carry this on, talking about some other aspects of our common history.
Thanks, Hannes. And I'll do some more research on this Pretorius. She absolutely fascinates me.
Yeah, and the Afrikaans, the Boer hunters in general, it's a very interesting subject. And unfortunately, as I say, not an awful lot known and not enough said about them. But they were also out there very early on and covered a hell of a lot of territory.
The one good thing about the British education system is that they taught us to write and to keep notes.
That's right.
Let's just hope they can carry on that good work by teaching our kids all the proper history.
That's right. That's right, Chris. All right, man. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Hannes. Pleasure.
Cheers, bye.
Cheers.